Hello, welcome to Biology, the scientific study of life. Lateralization of cortical function. During brain development, after birth, competing functions segregate and displace each other in the cortex of the left and right cerebral hemisphere, resulting in lateralization of functions. That left hemisphere becomes more adapted at language, math, logical operations, and the serial processing of sequences of information. It has a bias for the detailed speed optimized activities required for skeletal muscle control and the processing of fine visual and auditory details. The right hemisphere is stronger at pattern recognition, face recognition, spatial relations, nonverbal thinking, emotional processing in general, and the simultaneous processing of many kinds of information, understanding and generation the stress and intonation patterns of speech that convey its emotional content emphasize right hemisphere function, as does music. The right hemisphere appears to specialize in perceiving the relationship between images and the whole context in which they occur, whereas the left hemisphere is better at focused perception. Most right-handed people use their left hand controlled by the right hemisphere for cortex or holding, and use their right hand controlled by the left hemisphere for fine detailed movement. The two hemisphere normally work together harmoniously, trading information back and forth through the fibers of the corpus callosum. The importance of this exchange revealed in patients who have had their corpus callosum severed to control their epileptic seizures. When such split brain patients see a familiar word in their left field of vision, they cannot read the word because the sensory information that travels from the left field of vision to the right hemisphere cannot reach the language centers in the left hemisphere. Each hemisphere in these patients functions independently of the other. Language and speech. The systematic mapping the higher cognitive functions to specific brain areas began in the 19th century, when physicians learned that damage to particular regions of the cortex by injuries, strokes, or tumors can produce distinctive changes in a person's behavior. The French physician Pierre Broca conducted post-mortem examinations of patients who could understand language but could not speak. He discovered that many of these patients had defects in a small region of the left frontal lobe. That region now known as Broca's area is located in front of the part of the primary motor cortex that control muscles in the face. The German physician Karl Wernicke also conducted examinations and found that damage to a posterior portion of the temporal lobe, now called Wernicke's area, abolished the ability to comprehend speech, but left speech generation intact. Over a century later, studies of brain activity using fMRI and positron emission tomography (PET) have confirmed that Broca's area is active during the generation of speech, lower of the image, and that Wernicke's area is active when speech is heard, the upper left image. Broca's area and Wernicke's area are part of a much larger network of brain regions involved in language, reading a printed word without speaking activities, the visual cortex, upper right image, whereas reading a printed word out loud activities, both the visual cortex and Broca's area, frontal and temporal areas, become active when meaning must be attached to words, such as when a person generates verbs to go with nouns or groups related words to concepts. Lower right image. Emotions. Emotions are the result of a complex interplay of many regions of the brain. Prominent among these regions is the limbic system. The limbic system includes three parts of the cerebral cortex: the amygdala, hippocampus, and olfactory bulb, along with some inner portions of the cortex's lobes and sections of the thalamus and hypothalamus. These structures and sections of the thalamus and hypothalamus, these structures interact with sensory areas of the neocortex and other higher brain centers, mediating primary emotions that manifest themselves in behaviors such as laughing and carrying. It also attaches emotional feelings to basic survival-related functions controlled by the brainstem, including aggression, feeding, and sexuality. Moreover, the limbic system is central to some of the behaviors such as extended nurturing of infants and emotional bonding to other individuals that distinguish mammals from most reptiles and amphibians. Structures of the limbic system from early in development and provide a foundation for the higher cognitive functions that appear later during the development of new cortical areas. We are born with the brain circuits prepared to recognize the crude elements of faces, to support bonding to a caregiver, to have visual and vocal interactions with that caregiver, and to express fear, distress, and anger, learning, and memory process. Then build a history of the particular sensing and motor actions that are successful in obtaining warmth and food. We also begin very early to distinguish right from wrong, for example, by receiving happy or angry facial or vocal expressions from a caregiver. The amygdala structure in the temporal lobe is central, is recognizing the emotional content of facial expressions and laying down emotional memories. This emotional memory system seems to appear earlier in development than the system that supports explicit recall of events, which requires the hippocampus. Adults who learn to avoid an aversive situation, such as an image that is always followed by a mild electric shock, remember the image and experience autonomic arousal as measured by an increased heart rate or sweating if the image is presented again. Some adults with damage to the hippocampus report that they do not recognize the image, but the autonomic arousal still occurs because the emotional memory mediated by the amygdala is still intact. Conversely, other patients with damage confined to the amygdala do not exhibit autonomic arousal, but they recall that the amygdala do not exhibit autonomic arousal, but they recall that the image because explicit memory mediated by the hippocampus is intact. As children develop, primary emotions such as pleasure and fear are associated with different situations in a process that requires portions of the neocortex, especially the forwardmost part of the frontal lobes. Call it the prefrontal cortex. The remarkable medical case of Phineas Cage reveals just how important this emotional learning can be. In 1848, Cage was working on a railroad construction site when a dynamite explosion drove a meter-long iron rod through his head. The rod entered his skull just below his left eye and existed through the top of his head. Astonishingly, Gage recovered, but his personality was drastically changed. Once an efficient, capable foreman, he had become impatient, profane, and capricious. In the late 1990s, neuroscientists studied Gage's skull and determined that the rod had destroyed portions of his frontal lobe known to mediate emotions. Today, patients who are diagnosed with tumors or lesions in these regions sometimes suffer the same combination of the symptoms. Their intellect and memory seem intact, but their motivation, foresight, goal formation, and decision making are flawed. Their emotions and feelings also are diminished. Frontal lobotomy, a surgical procedure in which the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system is disrupted, was once widely performed to treat severe emotional disorders. However, the resulting docility in the patient was usually accompanied by a loss of the ability to concentrate, plan, and work toward goals. Therefore, drug therapy has replaced frontal lobotomy for treating such severely ill individuals. Memory and learning. Though we may not be aware of it, we are constantly checking what is happening right now against what just happened a few moments ago. We hold information, anticipation, or goals for a time in short-term memory locations in the frontal lobes and then release them if they become irrelevant. Should we wish to retain knowledge of a face or a phone number, the mechanisms of long-term memory are activated in a process that requires the hippocampus. If we later need to recall a name or number, we can fetch it from long-term memory and return it to short-term memory. The transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory is enhanced by a rehearsal. Positive or negative emotional states mediated by the amygdala and the associations of new data with data previously learned and stored in long-term memory. For example, it is easier to learn a new card game if we already have card sense from playing other games. Many sensory and motor association areas of the cerebral cortex outside the Broca's area and Wernicke's area are involved in storing and retrieving words and image. Studies of patients with the brain lesions and imaging studies on impaired subjects suggests, for example, that recognition of people is associated with the anterior part of the left temporal lobe, recognition of animals with the lower middle part of this lobe, and recognition of tools with the lower posterior part. Notice that the memorization of phone numbers, facts, and places, which can be very rapid and may require only one exposure to the relevant item, may rely mainly on rapid changes in the strength of existing neural connections. In contrast, the slow learning and remembering of skills and procedures, such as those required to improve one's tennis game, appear to involve cellular mechanisms very similar to ones responsible for brain growth and development. In such cases, neurons actually make new connections. Motor skills such as walking, tying your shoes, riding a bicycle, or writing are usually learned by repetition. You can perform such skills without consciously recalling the individual steps required to do these tasks correctly. Once a skill memory is learned, it is difficult to unlearn. For example, a person who has played tennis for years with a self-taught awkward backhand has a much tougher time learning to correct form than a beginner just learning the game. Habits, whether good or bad, are hard to break. Our gait, gestures, and accent are individual, and we are very aware of these traits in other people when we interact with them. Okay, thanks for listening.